We filed a lawsuit in the city of New York late last week challenging Mayor DeBlasio's latest edict that all outdoor, protest activity, fundamental First Amendment activity is banned in the city of New York. Yet he's got this open streets initiative where, groups of people can cycle and walk and do other things on these public streets that aren't constitutionally protected. But yet, if you're a protester with a sign and you're even maintaining social distancing, it's forbidden. I mean, they've essentially suspended the First Amendment in the city of New York. And when you have all these exceptions, and that's one of the things when you look at so many of these lawsuits and our lawsuits as well, one of the things we highlight typically is how irrational these decisions are. In Michigan, for example, you have this random selection of which businesses are going to be open, which ones aren't going to be open. And I saw one of the legislatures made a comment in the news to the effect that, you show up at one of the governor's press conferences and you wait for her to call your name, that your business is open, and okay, now we're magically open. It doesn't explain the decision-making that's going into this. And we know that Tesla just filed a lawsuit in California, and it's really going to that point. You have different counties who are issuing different orders based on what it's just irrational how this is all being played out. Why one business and why one car factory in one county can operate successfully and safely, but then in another county it can't. Why? What was the justification for why these two counties have different rules when actually it's the governor's executive order that was issued that should trump over everything? So it's just the irrational way that all this is being handled is what I think is very upsetting to most people, and quite frankly is also the strongest position we have as a marital law challenging all these provisions, whether they restrict fundamental liberties or whether they restrict property interests or any other liberty interests that we might have.
And what about these emergency orders that are giving these governors, mayors, county officials this carte blanche to be making the decisions? I looked into it here in California, and it appears that there's no time limit to the governor's declaration of a state of emergency. You would think at some point legislature comes in and can weigh in on it. But as far as I can tell, and talking to a couple California attorneys about it, and me doing a little bit of my own research, couldn't find any limit in California. Now in Michigan, I think you guys did have a limit there. And tell us about the battle between the state legislature and the governor there, where they're trying to put checks on her. Yeah,
that's Michigan's an interesting example, and I agree with your concern about in California. Like, when do these emergency powers end? Even like in Michigan, you have a 28-day declaration of a state of emergency, but then can you renew that on day 27 for another 28 days? What's very interesting about Michigan, and we had this conversation the last time that we spoke, that Michigan has in place a measure for legislative oversight for the governor, as there should be, and hopefully if there's one of the after action items at the end of all this is every state legislature needs to go back and look at what their emergency orders are and whether or not they put in place provisions that there is legislative oversight. There has to be. One person, we don't have a king or a queen, one person cannot be the one that's had the sole discretion of whether it should be or should not be open. When this erupted here in Michigan, the governor was principally relying on the Emergency Management Act, which was a 1976 act, which gives her authority. She declares a state of emergency. She has 28 days. After 28 days, she has to go back to the legislature and get an extension, which that makes a lot of sense to be able to do. And so she did, and the legislature gave an extension for 23 days. And this is what we had talked about it, and it was interesting to see that Michigan had a provision for legislative oversight. But I said, there's going to be a constitutional crisis that's going to be happening real soon when that extension runs out. And lo and behold, we are now in a crisis, because now the governor is relying on a 1945 order, statute, which is the Emergency Powers of Governor Act. And so she's claiming that she now has authority independent of the legislature by virtue of this Emergency Governors Powers Act, as opposed to the Emergency Management Act. And it's gotten so bad that actually many of the the county prosecutors and even law enforcement saying the governor's orders are invalid. Our Michigan Attorney General, who's in the same camp as our governor, she's a left-wing progressive, had to issue guidance on May 4th saying that, look, under the Emergency Governors Powers Act, these orders are lawful, and she expects them to be enforced as the top law enforcement officer of the state. Well, the legislatures have now sued the governor. And so this is in the Court of Claims. They've got a lawsuit going where there's a battle going on between our legislative branch and the executive branch of whether or not which is the act that's actually going to, that controls the, and when you read the language of the two acts, the Emergency Management Act, the one that gives legislative oversight, gives broader powers, and by its plain language, it would apply to a situation presented here, a large public health crisis where, you know, extraordinary measures need to be taken, but understanding you're going to take these extraordinary measures, you have legislative oversight. The Emergency Governor's Powers Act of 1945, when you read it, it was designed to be focused on really limited civil unrest, right? You have a riot that breaks out in Flint, Michigan, or Detroit, Michigan, or somewhere, and there's a limited, you know, a short period of time, a short duration, public crisis that the governor needs to act and has to draw on resources, maybe shut down roads, shut down travel, do different things that might restrict liberty, but it was certainly for a short duration. Now we've reached the point that she said, well, it's not the Emergency Management Act I'm relying on, it's the Governor's Powers Act, and it's unlimited. I don't have this legislative oversight. I'm in control. I'm going to do what I want to do. And
in Michigan, compared to the other three states we mentioned, you've got some check on power there because you've got a Republican legislature. Does the Republicans have both houses?
Yes.
Right. So in the other three states, you don't even have that. But you would think that why is the governor fighting the legislature over this? Don't you want the legislature? The legislature is the one that represents the people in all the different districts. Why is she so invested in her wanting it to be her alone making the decisions? Why not allow the legislature to decide it? Those are the ones that represent the people.
It makes zero sense to me, even politically. Right, because she's certainly taken a lot of hits here in Michigan. Now, whoever's advising her politically, this isn't helping the rising star at all. As you know, your listeners and viewers may recall, she's the one that gave the response to the Trump State of the Union address. So she's was considered a rising star in the Democrat Party, but she's taken a lot of hits here. And there was an online, I think it was a petition for recall, and they had like 300,000 online signatures. Now, granted, they're going to have to go out and canvass and get those. In fact, I also saw somebody sent a post where she has a fundraiser going called Stop the Recall. So Michigan has a way to recall a governor, so that could very well be taking place. But it makes zero sense to me. If you look at the national level, we discussed this a little bit before as well. You know, there's always the conflict when you're dealing with the use of the military. The president's the commander in chief. The Congress is the one that declares war. They created this this War Powers Act that you got to go to Congress after a certain amount of time. And that way, at that point, you can get the approval of Congress. And for many of the for the presidents, they do that because it makes sense in some respect, because you're getting now Congress to be vested in this and to kind of be on the same team. Whereas it doesn't even make sense politically why you would shun the legislatures and all the people that they represent. Michigan's a very, very diverse state in so many ways. It's a very interesting state politically, because we have all the unions, the automotive unions in Detroit. And so nationally, there's a lot of money that comes in on the national level, and our national level politicians, the state senators and the congressmen, tend to be more liberal and from the Democrat side. And I think that's largely from the unions and the likes. Whereas locally and at the state level, aside from our governor now, it's been for a long time conservative in the legislature. And why she would just be so dismissive of them and the way she is. It doesn't make sense in terms of how the government should run and how it should function, and it doesn't make sense politically. And now we've got the legislatures have sued her, and we've got the third branch of government, the judiciary, that's going to be weighing in on the extent of war. So it's a mess.
Has she restated what the objective is? Because I'm not sure I've seen any of these governors who told us that this was about flattening the curve, don't overwhelm the hospitals. They got us all to buy in on the idea of flattening the curve so we don't overwhelm the hospitals. None of us wanted to see people outside and lying in sidewalks and so on without beds available to them. But as we talked about before, the hospitals clearly are not overwhelmed. In fact, they're laying off employees and so on. So what is the new standard? Clearly, the standard is no longer not overwhelming the hospitals. Otherwise, you would have started getting people back a lot sooner. It would have happened weeks ago, and certainly would be happening in a big time now. So has she announced any new standard?
No, it's totally unclear to me. There's no rational basis for the decisions that she's making. And I know you wrote an article recently about Governor Cuomo making the comment about, it's every life is precious and of intimate value. And so now I guess the standard is, we don't want to lose one life because of COVID-19, which is, it's granted. I totally respect life. I'm pro-life and Governor Cuomo is pro-abortion. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy, but you can't use that as a standard if that's the case, and this thing's never going to end. I haven't heard the governor say this, but I've seen others saying it, that we shouldn't have a full open back up of the economy until we have a vaccine for this thing.
Right.
But we don't always have vaccines. We don't have a vaccine for AIDS. We don't have a vaccine for the regular flu.
Right.
A cure, you can get the flu shot, but it's not going to guarantee that you're not going to get the flu. The standards, the goalposts you mentioned, they just keep moving. When I do interviews about Governor Whitmer, I got to get a scorecard to keep track of where we are on Executive Order number 77 since this started out.
They've moved, and we don't know where they've moved to. That's the problem. Give us, okay, that's fine. If you decided it's no longer about overwhelming the hospitals, then what is it now about? Because it seems to me there's only 3 ways this thing gets resolved. You could get it down to absolutely 0 cases and also turn off all travel so that no new cases could come in, okay? Then the thing's theoretically done. That doesn't seem practical, that America could get down to 0 cases and cut off all travel, right? The other is you can stay locked down until there's a vaccine. That's 12 to 18 months away. No certainty that it'll ever be found. No certainty as to how effective the vaccine will be. Or you can go with herd immunity. Sweden appears to be going with herd immunity. They think that they're very close to it. That means that, sorry, but this thing is ultimately going to sweep the country. Let's make sure it doesn't do it so quickly so that we overwhelm the hospitals. But otherwise, that's the plan, is herd immunity. That does appear to have been what originally was the plan was. Again, looking at those charts that they showed us tons of people getting it over an extended period of time. So, governors, tell us, what are you trying to achieve now with your orders? Are you trying to get us down to 0 cases and cutting off all travel? Are you want us to wait 18 months and stay locked down until we get this possible vaccine? Or is the objective herd immunity? Because I think those are the only 3 options. And if the objective is herd immunity, then we need to start letting people out yesterday.
I totally agree with you. And then once we could figure out where those goalposts are, then I think the reason why they don't want to cement those goalposts in is because then now they have to justify how their restrictions are going to put that football through the post, as it were. Same with this analogy, but they keep moving the goalposts, so their restrictions are as random as what their objectives are. I don't know if they even know. I mean, it's just.
Well, I hope in your
case,
these
are leaders. They're horrible leaders. I don't know what to say. They don't certainly exude confidence in the people. I think people, when you see Tesla suing government officials in California, there's a problem going on.
Well, I hope that your cases somehow can help try to root that out. I hope that you really press them to basically say, hey, you need a fundamental, compelling government interest, and don't just tell me it's health, or don't just tell me all life is priceless and we want to save all lives. Tell me precisely what is your objective here. So let me ask you from a legal perspective, is that a fair question to ask them in court and require these states to come back and tell us what exactly, precisely are you trying to achieve? Not just broadly public health.
Yeah, it blends with not only stating the interest, but what it is, the restriction they have, how it promotes that interest, which then requires them to narrow down specifically what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and that the goal that they put in place is the least restrictive means of doing so. And it's longstanding in constitutional jurisprudence that when you're applying strict scrutiny in particular, and when, like, for example, in New York, when you're shutting down all First Amendment outdoor First Amendment activity, you're now in strict scrutiny standard. It's the highest level of scrutiny that the government has to satisfy. And it's their burden alone to convince the court that not only is the interest compelling, but that their means of achieving that also satisfy the least restrictive measure requirement. And it's very hard. There's a reason why when usually if you're applying strict scrutiny, it's almost fatal in fact to begin with, because the government has a very, very heavy burden to satisfy. And whenever you have these exemptions and the numerous exceptions that are in place, and you're dealing with the fundamental liberty, you lose strict scrutiny almost as a matter of law. And that's what we have here. Like in New York, you can't engage in group, First Amendment activity, protesting Mayor DeBlasio's policies on the streets outside of City Hall, but you can ride your bikes and do any other things out there. I mean, there's just those two things don't comport, and it is. I don't see how this is going to survive. How he's going to survive strict scrutiny.
So let's talk about what court rulings there are so far out there. I know you've brought some cases that resulted in some very favorable settlements in Michigan, but what about actual court rulings thus far about this pandemic?
Yeah, I'd have to do a survey. So much of these things are so quick. They're usually in TROs. And the two cases that we got stipulated court orders. The first one totally resolved itself on behalf of a pro-life demonstrator, where she had to concede that her order has to permit outdoor First Amendment activity, and the criminal complaint against him was dismissed.
Yeah, let's talk about that one just for a second, because it ties to your New York one. So bottom line, governor basically backed down and said, I get it, you got to allow First Amendment protesting. It wasn't a court ruling, it was the governor stepping away from that, right? That position.
Well, but to make sure there wasn't going to be any waffling and moving of the goalposts on this, we put it into a stipulated order between the parties, signed by the parties and signed by the judge, so that it would be an order that was enforceable and not just going off of some vague promise. So
your case against DeBlasio is very similar to that.
It is, but what's interesting with DeBlasio, because when you're suing a governor, they have 11th Amendment immunity in federal courts. And so all you can get is prospective relief, an injunction or a declaration. Sometimes these cases can be mooted, with the goalposts keep moving, and then they'll try to dismiss it on mootness grounds. The issue with DeBlasio, he's a city official. He did this as his authority as the mayor. He doesn't have 11th Amendment immunity. We have a nominal damage claim, so we're going to get a final resolution on this one way or the other. He's not going to be able to moot it out by backing away from it, because that bell has been rung, and we want to get that matter resolved.